The village slept under a blanket of silence, unaware that danger was already spreading like a monster with fiery breath. In the middle of the night, the cabin of the daughter of the most feared hunter began to glow red, then burst into violent flames. Smoke curled into the sky, sparks danced like angry stars, and the fire devoured everything in its path. People stayed hidden in their homes, trembling but frozen, waiting for someone else to act. Yet when every other soul chose silence, one man moved. It was not a warrior, not a hunter, not a man of great wealth or pride. It was Zito, the humble potter, a man forgotten at the edge of the village. He was known only for his clay-stained hands, his cracked feet, and the bricks he shaped each day. To most, he was little more than a shadow, part of the background of the village's life. When others celebrated at feasts, prayed together, or sang songs at weddings, he was never among them. He stood apart, quiet and invisible, as though his existence mattered to no one. They mocked his clothes, whispered about his poverty, and dismissed his presence as if he were less than a man. But that night, when fire roared and a desperate cry for help shattered the stillness, it was Zeto who stepped forward. He did not stop to think about who he was or how others saw him. He did not pause to wonder whether he would be remembered or forgotten. Fear struck him, fear of fire, fear of death, but courage pushed him harder than fear could hold him back. Without a second thought, he ran across the fields, straight toward the burning cabin, his heart pounding with only one truth. Someone inside was dying, and he was the only one who could change that. The flames were unbearable, the air so thick with smoke it clawed at his lungs. Sparks bit his skin and heat scorched his face. Yet Zito did not see the fire. He saw the hunter's daughter lying unconscious, trapped at the edge of death. In that instant, nothing else mattered. Not the insults he had endured, not the gossip that had chased him through his life, not the stares of those who thought him worthless. There was no room for doubt, only action. He ran into the inferno, his rough hands reaching for her fragile body. Her skin was hot, her breath shallow, her form limp like a leaf carried by the wind. His own clothes caught fire, his hands burned, but still he lifted her into his arms. Each step was a battle against smoke and flame, but he pressed on, determined to bring her out alive. At last, staggering but unbroken, Zito burst out of the cabin. His face was smeared with soot, his body marked with burns, yet in his arms he held the young woman, alive. In that moment, he knew he had done what only a true man would do. He had saved a life without asking for reward, without needing applause. But when morning came, the village did not cheer for him. Whispers spread of how the girl had been pulled from the fire, but there was no glory tied to his name. Instead, people muttered that luck had placed him there, that anyone could have done the same. Zito's courage was buried under the cold ashes of indifference. The cabin was gone, and though the girl had survived, the villagers gave no thanks. What burned him more than fire was their silence, their refusal to see him as anything more than the potter of clay. Yet something deeper had shifted. Though the villagers ignored him, Zito felt a quiet certainty inside himself. He had walked through fire and saved a life. That truth was enough, whether or not anyone else believed it. The young woman, when she finally awoke from her restless night, felt pain searing across her body. The burns ached, her chest trembled with weakness, and her eyes blurred from smoke and tears. But what startled her most was not the pain. It was the sight of the man at her side. She expected the strong arms of a hunter, the familiar face of someone respected by the village. But the figure who sat by her, weary yet steady, was none other than Zito, the man no one saw, the man of clay. He wasn't the hunter. He wasn't the strong man everyone expected to rescue her. It was Zito, the man made of clay, the one no one saw, the one Noon would ever have imagined capable of such a grand act. She tried to move, but her body was still weak. The heat from the flames still burned her skin. Her eyes searched for familiar things, but everything was blurred by smoke and tears. When she looked to the side, she saw Zito's face. It was covered in soot, his eyes deep and tired. His hands were burned, and his expression, though calm, carried the weight of a silent sacrifice. "You're alive. That's enough." These were Zito's words, simple, direct. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. What he did for her that night spoke louder than any words ever could. He had saved her from hell, and deep down the young woman knew this. She knew her life had been saved by the courage of a man who, in the eyes of most, had no value at all. She tried to thank him, but the words wouldn't come out. Something in her chest was tight. How could she thank a man who had never been considered part of the world she belonged to? How could she express her gratitude to someone who lived among bricks? In the shadows of the village, far from the spotlight of fame and wealth, Zito, for his part, didn't expect thanks. To him, the simple fact of having saved a life was more than enough. He didn't seek recognition nor applause. He was at peace with himself, and that was all that mattered. He didn't need the admiration of the village to know he had done what was right. But for the young woman, the scene was forever etched in her memory. She had never been saved like this so completely. When she was a child, she almost drowned in a river, and no one came to her aid. In that moment, her loneliness had felt eternal, as if no one would ever see her pain. But Stowe saw her. He saw her in the midst of the fire, in the midst of the despair. He didn't look at her social status or who she was. He saw her as a life to be saved, and that for her was the greatest act of kindness and respect anyone could offer. She felt small, almost insignificant in front of that man who, though despised by everyone, had done something no one else would have been capable of. In that moment, she felt small. But she also felt big, because inside her something was changing. Something she couldn't explain, but that was already taking shape. She knew their fates were somehow intertwined, and as she looked at Zet, something deep, something beyond simple gratitude, was beginning to bloom in her heart. A mixture of respect, admiration, and perhaps something more. She didn't know what it was yet, but she felt that in some way she was no longer the same. She was alive, but more than that, she was awake to something she never imagined could be possible. Zito, however, showed no exaggerated emotions. He didn't need words to make himself understood. He knew that in that moment she had understood the greatness of his gesture. He knew that what truly mattered was what she carried in her heart, not what others thought of her. She didn't know what the future held, but at that moment she felt that her view of Zeta was changing. It was no longer the gaze of a young woman saved from a fire. It was the gaze of someone who had found a foothold. Someone who for the first time saw something that had always been in front of her eyes, but that she had never truly noticed. Life, as always, would continue its course. The young woman would have to return to the village and face the looks, the judgments, and the words waiting for her. But in that moment, there was something stronger than social conventions or what people thought. There was a simple and powerful truth. She was alive thanks to Stowe. And somehow she knew that this truth would change her life forever. When Miguel, the feared hunter, finally returned to the village, all eyes turned to him. There was something different that day. He arrived on horseback, his expression closed as if carrying the weight of an important piece of news. His steps echoed through the dirt streets, and the sound of his heavy boots seemed to anticipate what was coming. He was not alone. Behind him came other hunters, men who shared his strength, fame, and authority. They were respected, feared, almost revered. Miguel, as the leader of the group, was the example to follow. The village knew what he represented. He was the hunter who brought security, who'd ensured the protection of the community for many years. He was the center of social life, the man whose word carried weight. But today, something was about to change. The village was bracing itself for what seemed like revenge, a punishment for an act no one yet understood. The fire in the cabin, the cry of the daughter, Zito's courage. Everyone was waiting with silent expectation for Miguel to bring the answer, the punishment, or perhaps an explanation. The hunter stopped in front of Zito's house. The other men stood behind him waiting. The wind blew, and the silence in the village grew even stronger. No one dared to speak. Even the children who normally ran through the streets stopped to watch what would happen here in this moment, would be remembered for generations. Miguel dismounted his horse calmly. He was imposing with broad shoulders and piercing eyes. His presence dominated the space, and everyone, even the bravest, felt the weight of his gaze. But what he did next made the village fall even more silent. With a firm voice, he looked at Zeto, who was on the ground, not lifting his head. "Were you the one who saved my daughter?" Miguel asked. The question was simple, direct, but in the way it was asked, with the calm of someone who already knew the answer, there was something that couldn't be ignored. Stowe, without hurry, looked at him. He wasn't in a position to apologize. He wasn't there to justify himself. He simply raised his head slowly and nodded, confirming that yes, he was the one who saved Miguel's daughter. No more words were needed. Stowe, with his simplicity, accepted the hunter's gaze without moving, without leaving his place. He knew that in that moment words were unnecessary. What mattered was in the gesture. Miguel looked at the man who in everyone's eyes was just a poor brickmaker, the man made of clay, the one no one saw. But what he saw in that moment was much more than Zito's calloused hands or his body covered in the grime of work. He saw courage. He saw a man who without hesitation entered the fire to save his daughter. He saw beyond appearances, beyond what couldn't be ignored. It was then that Miguel dismounted, the weight of his decision hanging in the air. He walked up to Stowe and extended his hand. A simple gesture, but powerful. "Then I'll give you what no one here has given," he said with a grave tone full of meaning. Respect. The village was in shock. No one knew how to react to that. How could someone like Miguel, the most feared and respected man, give respect to Stowe, the man who lived on the margins, who had never been acknowledged? What did this mean? Was it a gesture of humility, or was it something deeper, something the village was not yet ready to understand? The people looked at Stowe, waiting for a reaction, but he didn't move. He simply looked at the outstretched hand and shook it slowly, as if there was no need for further explanations. Stowe, the man made of clay, didn't seek recognition. What he had done was done. He didn't need anything else. The village fell silent, not knowing what to say. What had just happened had no precedent. A humble man, ignored by all, had saved the life of a powerful hunter's daughter. And this same hunter, in a gesture of gratitude, had offered Zeta what he needed most: respect. But what no one knew was that the true respect didn't come from Miguel or the village. The true respect was in the way Stowe had acted, in his quiet courage, in his unconditional love. And in the end, that was worth more than any public gesture. The change began there in that moment, and no one knew, but everything was about to be turned upside down. Stowe, the man made of clay, was beginning to be recognized not by the clothes he wore, nor the place he lived, but by what he represented. Here presented what everyone had forgotten: the courage to do what is right even when no one is watching. What happened next? No one could predict. But in that instant, the village began to realize that the value of a person is not in what they have, but in what they are. The next morning, Miguel's words reverberated through the village. That simple gesture, the handshake between the hunter and the man of clay, left everyone in a state of bewilderment. Noon expected the story to take this turn. No one imagined that the feared hunter, the one who commanded them all, would bow before Stowe, the nameless man, the man of clay. The people murmured in groups, in the squares, and at the doorways of houses. What really happened there? What did that gesture mean? For many, it seemed like a kind of humiliation for the figure of authority that was Miguel. But for others, it was an opening to something new, something no one imagined could exist in these days. And it was in the middle of this confusion of feelings that Meta, without haste, returned to Stowe's house. He didn't bring a crowd of hunters with him, nor did he adopt his intimidating posture. He came alone with the same serious expression, but without the tension of the first visit. The man who always had harsh answers now seemed to carry something lighter, something different. When he reached Zito's door, he did not come as a boss who commands, but as a man who had found a truth in his heart. He knocked firmly but respectfully. Zito, as always, opened the door with his tranquil demeanor, showing no excessive emotion. But the sight of that man, once his superior, standing there now in such a simple way, made the whole scene shift. "I've come to do something I've never done before," Miguel said, looking Zito in the eyes. "I want to give you what no one here has ever given you: respect." Miguel's tone was filled with sincerity. It wasn't an obligation. It wasn't a concession from the powerful to the weak. It was in fact a true change in his soul, and as he spoke, He dismounted his horse again slowly and walked towards Zito, who still didn't move, watching everything with his usual calm. "I owe you more than just words. I owe you an action," Miguel said, extending his hand. Zito, with his usual humility, didn't move much, but accepted the offer. He shook the hunter's hand slowly, without haste, without fanfare. He didn't need grand declarations, nor did he need cheers or applause. The simple fact of being recognized, of having his courage validated, was more than he had ever imagined. The handshake wasn't just the exchange of gestures, it was a silent pact between the two men. Miguel, the hunter, acknowledged the value of the man he had never considered an equal, and Zito, the man of clay, knew that true strength did not come from what he had, but from who he was. That morning, the village people, who had been expecting a condemnation, found themselves in front of a completely different scene. The hunter had not only recognized Zito as a man, but also showed them that true greatness doesn't reside in titles, but in actions and human values. The gesture was a silent lesson that echoed through all the houses of the village. Zito, in his simplicity, asked for nothing more. He didn't ask for wealth, fame, or great changes in his life. He had already done what he felt he needed to do. And Miguel, in turn, understood that true honor didn't come from hunts or trophies, but from the ability to recognize the value in others, even when it meant abandoning old pride. That gesture from Miguel, seemingly simple, was what truly made the deepest impact. It wasn't the revenge everyone had expected, but something stronger, a request for respect, something the village had never given to ZTO. And what followed was not what the people had imagined. It wasn't a distancing of ZTO, it wasn't a new division. On the contrary, respect slowly spread like seed planted in fertile soil. In that moment, Zito unknowingly became a symbol of quiet courage, inner strength, and humility. And Miguel the hunter began to be seen differently. He was no longer just a powerful man, the chief of the village. He was also a man who knew how to recognize his mistakes, who had the humility to ask for forgiveness, not with words, but with actions. And so the gratitude did not come as the people had expected. It wasn't formal. It wasn't a spectacle. It was a simple gesture, but deep down it brought the greatest transformation anyone could wish for: mutual respect and acceptance. In the days that followed Miguel's unexpected gesture, the village seemed to settle into a new reality. The respect for Zito, though subtle, began to grow in the hearts of even the most skeptical. But it was the young woman, the hunter's daughter, who took the most surprising action. She who had once been imprisoned not only by the flames, but also by the expectations of her father, and everyone around her, now found herself free to do what she desired. And what she desired more than anything was to return to the man of simple hands, the one who had rescued her from death. It wasn't just gratitude, it was a deep feeling, something more than she could fully understand. She began to visit Zito. At first, she brought only small gifts: homemade bread, tea she had prepared herself, simple gestures, but full of meaning. It wasn't about repaying the life he had saved. Nothing could repay that, but it was a way to be near him, to better understand who he was. Zito's house, so modest, was far from a place of luxury or comfort. But for her, there was refuge there, a place of peace she couldn't find in the life of parties and expectations that her father had imposed. Zito, as always, spoke little. He didn't know how to act in front of someone who for so long had lived in a reality that had nothing to do with his. He knew that for her, being there with him was much more than just an expression of thanks. But he didn't want to give her false hope. He knew that for her his life would always be a distant point, difficult to cross, but at the same time there was something about her that drew him in. Perhaps it was the purity with which she treated him without judgment, without looking at his appearance or his origins. She began to spend hours there, talking about life, about things she had never allowed herself to share. Zito listened with a rare attention, something that no one else knew how to do. He didn't interrupt, didn't give opinions. He simply listened in a way that seemed to understand the words she didn't say. And she unknowingly began to see Zito with new eyes, not as the simple brickmaker of the village, but as someone who understood more than anyone. He saw her pain, her loneliness, the emptiness she carried inside. Despite her beauty, despite being the daughter of a hunter, she in turn began to see something more in Zito. He didn't see her as the hunter's daughter. He didn't see her as the young woman always surrounded by admiring eyes. He saw her as a human being with fears, dreams, and desires, and in some way she felt more real there with him than anywhere else. The man made of clay, who never needed recognition, had become the only one who saw her without the mask she had created for herself. In the early visits, she felt discomfort. She felt out of place in that simple environment, surrounded by Zito's humility and silence. She didn't know how to behave, didn't know how to talk about the feelings that were beginning to grow inside her. But with time, the visits became more frequent. She sat at Zito's small table talking about the day, about the things he did, about the hard work of each day. And slowly, Stowe began to speak more. Not about his life, but about what he saw in the world around him. He didn't need to tell his story. He showed it in his gestures, in his actions. It was a silent yet deep connection. There was no rush, no expectations, just the simple pleasure of being together, sharing moments that for her were more authentic than any ball or social gathering her father had ever organized. The young woman, who had once lived in a world of appearances, was beginning to discover something far more real, a simple truth, but one that touched her in an inexplicable way. The village, of course, watched everything with curious eyes. Will she go back to the house of clay? The neighbors asked, do you think after being the daughter of a hunter, she will marry the man of clay? The words began to circulate and mouths opened. But she by now didn't care as much about what others thought in Zito's house. She felt she could finally be who she really was without the judgments and obligations that weighed on her. Zito, with his silence, with his way of being, began to be the figure she had been seeking without even knowing. He didn't want to change anything in her life. He didn't want to be a hero or the center of her attention. But somehow his presence freed her. He didn't obligate her to anything, not to gratitude, not to love. He simply accepted her as she was. And that to her was more than she ever imagined she would find. These moments, these simple conversations began to make the young woman question her own life. Whether she was just a figure to be admired, or if she could be someone with a voice, with choices. And Zito, assolently as he was immense, was helping her find answers she didn't even know she was searching for. It was a peaceful morning when Zito and the young woman decided to go to the spring to collect water. It was a simple task, one that everyone in the village did naturally. For her, it was an opportunity to spend more time with Zito, free from the pressure of curious gazes and the expectations that weighed on both of them. They walked side by side in silence, as always happened when they were together. The path to the spring wasn't long, but it was enough for the tension she had been feeling to slowly dissipate. Stu never showed any sense of urgency. His steps were slow and firm, as if he knew exactly the pace he should follow. He didn't need words to fill the empty spaces, and she gradually learned to appreciate this comfortable silence. The water from the spring was crystal clear, cold, and pure. They filled the buckets carefully, without hurry, as if that moment was the only thing that mattered in the world. The young woman focused on the task, but her thoughts kept returning to Zito's presence. Something was changing inside her. The simple, unadorned life of that man was beginning to fascinate her. He had no riches, no status, but somehow he possessed something far more valuable, the peace that emanated from his soul. It was when they were preparing to head back that something unexpected happened. The buckets were heavy, and she had to adjust her position to balance the load. It was at that moment that, without meaning to, her hand brushed against Zito's. The touch was soft, almost imperceptible, but something about his skin made her pause for a moment. For a brief instant, the world seemed to stop spinning. The touch was almost a shock, a small contact that somehow felt full of meaning. She didn't quickly withdraw her hand, as most people would in such a situation. Instead, their hands slingered, almost fitting together, as if that brief contact had transcended the simple physical act. Zito looked at her with a serene expression, and for the first time she felt vulnerable. That simple touch, almost accidental, carried more significance than she had ever imagined. Zito, always so calm, didn't rush to remove his hand. He simply left it there without hurry, as if the world around them had paused. She, in turn, looked at him, trying to understand what was happening inside her. The touch was nothing more than an accident. But the feeling it left seemed to last longer than that simple gesture. "Don't you fear me?" he asked, his voice calm, almost as if he were trying to understand what was going on in his own heart. She smiled slightly, as if releasing the tension that had built up inside her. "Fear. I felt more fear among the rich, where they never truly saw me." Those words hung in the air like an echo. She didn't quite know what she was saying, but she knew she was speaking the truth. She felt a greater fear among those who were judgmental, who saw her appearance and what she represented, but never saw who she really was. Stu, on the other hand, had never looked at her with those eyes. He saw her as someone who deserved to be heard, someone with more to offer than society's conventions dictated. They continued their walk back, but the silence between them now carried a new layer. Something had changed, but neither of them knew exactly what it was. It wasn't the kind of change that could be seen immediately. It wasn't something that could be identified with words or grand gestures. It was a silent change, like a seed planted in fertile soil, beginning to grow slowly. She knew that the world around them still held the same judgmental eyes, the same expectations, but in that moment, what she felt beside Zdo was something new, something she hadn't known she needed until she experienced it. The simple touch of their hands, the warmth of his skin, the lightness of that moment, everything made her feel more complete than she ever had before. Zdo, for his part, didn't think of things so clearly. Heck knew there was something between them, but he didn't rush to understand what it was. He felt without words that she needed him, but he also knew that he couldn't force anything. He had never asked for anything from anyone, and he knew that true beauty lay in allowing things to unfold naturally. The young woman with a heart more at peace didn't dare ask anything. She didn't need explanations nor promises. She already felt that something inside her had transformed, something that made her stronger, more real. And Zdo, with hisslant presence, was there to help her discover that for herself. The touch of their hands, that simple and unexpected moment, became the first of many small, silent revolutions in the hearts of both of them. As always, the village didn't take long to spread the rumors. Where there had been silence, words soon followed. The neighbors, those who had never paid attention to Zito, began to whisper among themselves. The eyes of the village, which had once been focused only on the great hunters, now turned toward him, the man of clay, and toward Miguel's daughter. Change was happening slowly, but its presence was undeniable. "Is she really going to marry the man who lives in the clay?" one voice said in the narrow streets of the village. Others murmured in agreement. The tone was full of disdain, as if the very idea was an affront to everything the village stood for. The daughter of the hunter, the girl everyone expected great marriages and golden rings from, now seemed to be heading for a completely different fate. After being the daughter of a hunter, now she's the lover of a brickmaker. The moths of the neighbors continued, always ready to judge, to spread shame. They didn't understand, couldn't see what was good in Zito's simplicity, in his silent courage. To them, the young woman's change of attitude seemed incomprehensible. How could she abandon her past, her origins, to live with a man with no wealth, no status? How could she lower herself to this? The murmurs spread like fire and dry leaves, quickly reaching the farthest houses. But while the people spoke, the young woman didn't care. She'd already grown accustomed to the comments, to the disapproving glances. She had grown up in a world where appearance, social position, and wealth mattered more than what truly mattered. But with Zito, things had begun to change. He didn't look at her like everyone else. He saw her for who she really was, not for what she presented. However, not everything was so simple. Deep down, she knew that the weight of others' opinions still affected her, still hurt. The judgment of the neighbors, which she had once ignored, now seemed harder to bear. Every time she walked through the square and heard the whispers of the women, the weight of their words grew stronger. They spoke as if she were weak, as if she were giving in to a destiny of inferiority. And although she knew this wasn't true, it still hurt. One morning after one of her meetings with Zito, she found herself facing the stares of the neighbors who followed her with critical and judgmental eyes. They looked at her with that expression she had come to know well, a mix of disdain and condemnation. Some even shook their heads as if the destiny of a hunter's daughter was far more dignified than living among the humble. But instead of looking away, the young woman raised her head. She didn't exactly know why she did it. But in that moment, a sense of strength rose within her. She knew she was doing what she felt was right, and that was enough. She no longer felt ashamed, nor did she care about the comments. What mattered most was what was inside of her, not what others said. She walked on without haste, unconcerned by the words cast in her direction. And deep down, she knew this was just the beginning of something bigger. The true change wasn't in the eyes of others, but within herself. The way she saw herself, the value she gave to herself, was what was beginning to shape the future. And Stowe, without saying a word, was there to help her realize this. He had never asked for anything, never pressured, but his presence, his way of being, was teaching her more than any words could. As the neighbors continued to talk, Zeto was as always in his house of clayworking. He knew what was going on. He knew that the words of others could hurt, but he also knew that the only voice that mattered was hers. He didn't care about what the people said. He never had. To him, what was happening between them was something natural, something that was unfolding without haste, without the need for quick answers or explanations. It was simply a silent connection, an understanding that went beyond words and judgments. And in the midst of this, the young woman began to realize that what mattered most was not what others thought, but what she felt. She was learning to listen to herself, to respect herself. Stu knowingly was helping her find a new path, one where self-respect mattered more than any status or appearance. Time passed, and the relationship between Zeto and the young woman strengthened in a silent but profound way. The visits became more frequent, and slowly she no longer saw things the way she had before. The village with its opinions and judgments seemed increasingly distant. But there was one person, only one, who still held power over her fate. Her father, Miguel the hunter, hadn't commented on Stowe any further, but his attitude until then continued to weigh heavily on everything. He had respected Z's gesture, but he knew things were not as simple as they seemed. The pride of a father who had always wanted the best for his daughter was still at play. He knew his daughter no longer saw him the same way. Something had changed in her, and he couldn't ignore it. It was on a peaceful afternoon that Miguel called Stowe to his house. It wasn't an expected or planned meeting, just a request, simple and direct, as if he was finally ready to face the truth that had been hidden right before his eyes. Zito, as always, appeared at the precise moment. He didn't expect anything from Miguel, but knew that sooner or later this encounter would have to happen. The hunter, with his imposing presence and firm voice, looked at him and asked the question everyone expected. But no one dared to ask. "If you want my daughter, come ask as a man," said Miguel, with a tone that left no room for doubt. Stu calmly watched him, not in a hurry to answer. He knew he wasn't a man of many words, but he also knew that in that moment, the answer Miguel was looking for wouldn't come from anyone's mouth, but from Zito's actions. Zito remained silent for a few seconds, feeling the weight of the question. He knew that for Miguel, his daughter was more than just a relationship. She was a treasure, someone to be protected, someone with whom he had a bond of love and pride. But for Zito, things weren't like that. He didn't see the young woman as a possession or something to be conquered. "She is neither prey nor land," Zito replied firmly. "I will go only if she wants me to." Zito's words hung in the air, simple and powerful. There was no need for further explanation. He wasn't there to ask permission, nor to submit to the rules of a man who still saw his daughter as something to be possessed. He didn't feel inferior, nor did he need validation from anyone. He just wanted the young woman to be free to make the choice that in her heart she had already made long ago. Miguel the hunter looked at Stowe with a mix of surprise and respect. Zito's answer was more than he had expected. It wasn't a marriage proposal. It wasn't a plea. It was a statement that Zito wasn't there for status or interest, but for something much deeper, love and respect for his daughter. Miguel looked at his daughter, who was behind a door, watching what was happening. He knew she had already made her decision, and as he looked at her, he saw something he had never seen before. She was no longer a young woman submitting to the path he had imposed on her, but a woman with her own choices, her own way. He turned to her with a look that for the first time carried no judgment or imposition. "She has already chosen," Miguel said, looking at Stowe, then at his daughter. "The day he carried you, you already chose the young woman." With teary eyes, said nothing. She simply looked at Stowe, and he, in response, looked back at her with a silent affection, full of understanding. There was no need for words anymore. They already knew what that moment meant. Miguel, then without saying anything more, lowered his head in respect. The gesture wasn't just a concession but a deep acceptance. He understood that his daughter was no longer a young woman following her father's path, but a woman now taking the reins of her own life. And by doing so, she was giving him something far more valuable than any wealth: her freedom, her truth. Stu, for his part, didn't make grand gestures or demand anything. He simply thanked him with a calm look, as though he knew the greatest gift had already been given. And in that moment, what seemed like a simple permission was in fact a transition of power. A moment when Miguel, the hunter, passed the baton to his daughter, allowing her to write her own story alongside a man who respected her and saw her for who she truly was. The young woman finally approached Stowe. The look between them was now full of meaning, a truth that didn't need to be spoken. It wasn't about what others thought, nor about what her father had envisioned for her. It was about what she felt, what she wanted for her life, and with a serene smile, she knew she was making the right choice. The day of the wedding arrived without grand ceremonies, without the pomp that many had expected. There were no bridesmaids adorned with sequins or elaborate banquets worthy of the young woman's social position or the reputation of her father, the feared hunter. Instead, the wedding took place in the same yard where Zito spent his days making the bricks that supported his simple life, the earth beneath their feet, the open sky as a roof, and the sun as a witness. Nothing could have been more true for them. The bride, with her hair tied up and a simple dress sewn with her own hands, didn't mind the lack of luxury, for her simplicity held more value than any wealth. The dress didn't need to be made of silk, and the flowers at the altar didn't have to be imported. She was humble, but the beauty of the moment couldn't be measured in gold or silver. She knew that what was happening there was much greater than any party or decoration could represent. Miguel, the bride's father, was present. His eyes, which had once been full of pride and judgment, were now misty. It wasn't tears of sadness, but of recognition. He looked at his daughter and saw a woman who had chosen her own path, not out of fear or obligation, but out of the love she felt. And by giving his daughter to Stowe, he knew she was making the right choice. "It was the poor man who saved what is richest to me," Miguel said, his voice thick with emotion, as he handed over his daughter to the man who, in his humility, had become a true hero. There was no arrogance in Miguel's words, only a deep acknowledgement of the values Stowe brought into his daughter's life. The wedding didn't have grand speeches, nor loud laughter, but there on the simple ground was the kind of union the world could not see, the union based on respect, understanding, and true love. Stu and the young woman exchanged quiet glances throughout the ceremony. They didn't need words to express what they were feeling. What they shared was greater than any ritual or tradition. It was a silent and powerful choice to live life side by side. The hunters and other members of the village who had gathered to witness the wedding couldn't hide their discomfort. They were used to seeing young people marry with grand festivities, with gold rings and embroidered dresses. But here in this simple yard, they were witnessing something they couldn't fully understand. And as they saw the respect Miguel had for Zto, as they saw the happiness in the young woman's eyes, many began to realize that the value of things wasn't in what could be seen, but in what could be felt. Some hunters who had once mocked Zto began to understand that love couldn't be measured by wealth or status. There was nothing inferior about Zto, nothing that made him less deserving than any other man in the village. He didn't own land, he didn't have gold, but he had something that many others lacked: dignity and heart. And slowly this recognition spread among those who had once looked at him with contempt. Stowe and the young woman's wedding wasn't perfect in the eyes of the village. It didn't have the grandeur everyone expected, nor the luxury many desired, but it had something far more precious, something few could see on the surface. It had truth. It had the kind of love that arises from the purity of a heart that doesn't seek applause, but lives for the beauty of a moment shared. The young woman, who had once been only the hunter's daughter, was now a wife by choice, and her choice was clear to everyone. It didn't matter what others thought. What mattered was that she had chosen Zito with all his imperfections, with all his simplicity, and that choice, more than anything else, was what made her true. The mockers fell silent. There was nothing more to say. The respect for ZTO, which had once been impossible, was now undeniable. The house of clay, which had once been a source of shame for many, now represented the true strength of a union built not with gold, but with the bricks of love and loyalty. And as the hunters passed by, their gazes were no different. They no longer saw humility as weakness. They saw the strength that resided in the truth of each gesture, in the simplicity of a life lived with dignity. In the end, what became clear to everyone, though few said it out loud, was that true. Wealth wasn't in material goods, but in the courage to be who you are without fear of judgment. And in that simple but profound wedding, Zto and the young woman gave everyone a silent lesson. A person's value isn't measured by what they have, but by who they are. After the simple and silent wedding, Zito and his wife began to build a life together. There was no rush, no external pressures. The house made of clay, which had once been a symbol of their humble condition, now became the foundation of a new beginning. Zeta, with his callous hands, began constructing a new home. But contrary to what many had thought, it wasn't just a structure made of bricks and wood. It was a construction of dreams, of hopes, and above all, of love. The young woman, now Zto's wife, was by his side at every stage of the process. She didn't mind the simplicity of the house. To her, what mattered was the fact that they were creating something together, something that represented their commitment, mutual respect, and the life they had chosen to build. She spent her days with him, helping in any way she could, always by his side, and every brick they placed seemed to symbolize a piece of the future they were creating. A future where appearances didn't matter, but what truly mattered was the connection between them. She planted flowers around the house, making it even more beautiful, more alive. The colors of the flowers contrasted with the earthy color of the bricks, creating a harmony that represented the union of their lives. The house made of clay, once seen as a symbol of shame, was now transformed into a point of pride for the couple. There, in that simple space, they were creating something that couldn't be measured in gold or possessions, but in the value they gave each other, in their respect and love with which they built every wall, every roof, every space. As the house took shape, visitors began to arrive. The hunters, those who had once looked at Stowe with disdain, began to pass by, heads lowered, respecting the work he and his wife were creating. They didn't speak much, but their look said it all. The house of clay, which had once been a source of mockery, was now a point of visit, a silent inspiration for everyone who saw the value in the sincere effort of a man and a woman who were building their life with what they had. Courage, hard work, and love. The house, though simple, was full of life. There was something in it that was more valuable than any stone mansion or gold. It was the house where truth reflected in every corner, where decisions were made based on respect, and where what mattered most were not the things they possessed, but what they felt for each other. Stu and his wife didn't need anything more. What they had between them was enough to build what they wanted at home. Over time, she began to realize that it wasn't luxury that made her happy, but the sense of belonging she felt by Z's side. He had never promised riches, never offered exbatons, but he had given her something much more valuable: the freedom to be who she was without masks, without expectations. He treated her with a respect and understanding she had never experienced before. And as she saw the other hunters pass by, lowering their heads in respect, she knew that this was just the beginning of a larger change. What began as a simple house built with clay and wood soon became a symbol of something much deeper: the power of courage, humility, and true love. The people of the village, who had once seen Zito as an invisible man, now respected him not because of his wealth or status, but for the value he represented as a human being. As someone who didn't bow down to conventions, but followed the truth of his own heart, Zito and his wife, in the silence of their clay house, were doing something few could fully understand. They weren't just building a physical house. They were building a life together, a home based on truth and love, something that couldn't be destroyed by fire, by criticism, or by words of judgment. They had found something that many spend their entire lives searching for, a home not made of walls and roofs, but made of understanding, respect, and the commitment to live with truth. And when the last wall was raised and the roof was placed, Zito looked at his wife, and they both knew there was nothing left to be conquered. They had already achieved what truly mattered: the love for each other and the respect they had earned, not just between them, but also before everyone else. Time passed, and with it, the transformation became more and more evident. Zito, the man of clay, became something more than anyone could have predicted. He went from being invisible to a silent symbol of courage and integrity. Those who had once ignored him or even mocked him now saw him in a different light. He didn't care about the change in perspective from others, but he couldn't help but notice that his truth had at last silenced those who had doubted him. The young woman who was once merely the daughter of the hunter was now no longer just that. She was a wife by choice, not by obligation or tradition. Her life had been transformed in a way that was as simple as it was profound. It was no longer about the heritage or the social position she carried. She was now the owner of her own story, a woman who had made her own choice without fear of others' expectations. Miguel, the hunter father, had also transformed. The man who had once tried to shape his daughter in his image, with his own vision of her future, now saw her life differently. He'd learned to give up pride, to let go of the standards he had imposed, and in his humility, he began to respect his daughter's choices. The hunter once feared was now recognized as someone who had learned to value gratitude and truth. The clay house, which for many had represented shame, now became a symbol of everything they had achieved. Every brick, every flower planted around it, every piece of the construction carried with it a story of sacrifice, courage, and love. What had started as a point of scorn was now a landmark of respect, and all the hunters who passed by now lowered their heads in acknowledgement. They saw what had been built, and felt that nothing in the world could be stronger than what Zito and his wife had. Something genuine, something authentic, something that couldn't be knocked down by criticism or envy. The respect Zito earned didn't come from words or grand gestures. He earned it through his quietude, his willingness to act correctly without expecting applause. He didn't seek revenge or justifications. His act of saving Miguel's daughter was only the beginning of a silent but intense journey that led him to be recognized as a man of honor. The people of the village, who had once laughed, now reflected on what had happened. The greatest lesson didn't come from words, but from actions. True strength isn't found in wealth or possessions, but in who you are. True dignity doesn't come from what you have, but from how you act in the face of adversity. Zito never asked for recognition, but he earned it because his life reflected the highest moral standard: respect for people, for truth, and the courage to be who you are without needing to justify yourself. And so the story became more than just the journey of a man and a woman. It was the story of a community that slowly learned that true greatness isn't measured by wealth or status, but by character. There was no more room for old mockery or contemptuous stares. What remained was a deep respect, growing like a strong tree, rooted in the hearts of all. That simple house of clay was now more valuable than any palace of gold, because there resided the true wealth, love, and truth. In the end, Zito, the young woman, and even Miguel understood that what had saved them wasn't the fire that consumed the cabin, but the courage to live without fear of being who they were. What had been built wasn't just walls of clay, but a life of dignity and respect. And so the most ignored man in the village became the symbol of true silent courage. And the woman who was once seen only as the hunter's daughter became respected as a wife by her own choice. The symbolic justice was complete. The emotional relief came from the profound recognition, the understanding that true love and respect do not follow hierarchies imposed by society, but the sincerity of hearts. Zato and his wife, with their simple life, taught everyone that the value of a human being isn't in wealth or status, but in what they are on the inside, and that no one could ever take away. If this story touched your heart, let us know where you're watching from. Leave a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to the channel. That really helps us keep bringing you real and emotional stories like this one. Thank you for being part of our